Good evening. My name is Mia and I'm a part of the Sterling Christian Union. Tonight we're going to be hearing a talk on something more than wishful thinking. Has science disproved God? Now, in 2 weeks' time, we will be continuing with this theme of something more, with evening events that are COVID safe and COVID friendly, of course. We're going to be having a guerrilla Christian, an escape room, a quiz, an evening with a man called Billy McCurry, who will be talking to us about his life as a terrorist in the Northern Irish Troubles, and much more. So please keep an eye out for those on our social media pages. They should be coming up in our chat on Facebook. After tonight's talk, we will be having a Q&A. So please send any questions that you have for our speaker on the Slido link that should also be coming up in the chat. Speaking of our speaker, his name is Andy Bannister. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Mia. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Tell us where you are right now. I know you're on Zoom with us on Facebook and on YouTube, but in the world, where are you?
Yes, it feels like we're all living in little boxes, doesn't it? So I am just down the road from you folks in Stirling. I'm in Dundee, so about an hour from you folks at home, kind of thing. But glad I can be with you at least virtually in pixelated form this evening.
Yes, the world of Zoom is a new dimension, isn't it?
It feels like that.
Now, Andy, before you tell us about whether or not science has disproved God, tell us something about yourself. What's the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you?
Oh, I love that you go for the really kind of easy, non-embarrassing kind of question.
What we want to hear.
Yeah, so the most embarrassing thing. Yeah, the most embarrassing thing. It's so embarrassing, it still casts a shadow over me some 20 years on. And it was about 20 years ago. I had just gotten married and I decided I would take my new wife out to a nice little Italian restaurant near where we live. Some lovely romantic evening, table for two, candlelight. It was phenomenal. And then at the end of the evening, I decided to be romantic and I sort of leaned in for a little bit of a kiss. And suddenly my wife leapt back and shrieked and she said, "You're on fire, you're on fire." And it turns out she wasn't talking about my rugged charm. Well, literally, I'd got too close to the candle and my hair gel had ignited. And there was a flame apparently about 2 inches long. So reacting quickly, she took a glass, sort of carafe of water and poured it over me. So then I'm dripping wet, smell of burning hair drifting across the restaurant, everybody looking at us. And I confess I never went back to that restaurant again. And I've still got a slight little thin spot up there where 20 years ago I literally just burnt my scalp. Didn't hurt, but it was quite dramatic. So I never do things by halves. That's science for you as well, right? Combustion and all that.
But was it worth it for you? The smelling hair and the
she and I are still married over 20 years on, so maybe she was impressed by my ability to withstand pain.
So the hair's there, the marriage is there, everything's good. You got to get out of it.
Everything's good, but still, when I see Italian restaurants and candles, I still get nervous. I think I need therapy. I need some counselling there just to deal with that repressed anxiety.
It sounds like there's still something there.
Definitely, absolutely, something there.
Well, thank you for sharing that sort of embarrassing story. I feel like we all know something about you now. But yeah, let's not waste any time. I'd love to hear what you're going to say and tell us about whether or not Christianity is something more than wishful thinking.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Mia, and thanks. Good evening to all of you watching at home or wherever you are catching this evening on Catch Up. I'm just going to, if the technology works, I'm just going to flip across and start my slide deck, and hopefully you can see my slides for tonight's talk. And I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. And I certainly meet many people today, in terms of tonight's topic, who think that science kind of has disproven God, that God is wishful thinking, and that science is simply rendered belief in God and belief in religion certainly irrelevant. And for people of that persuasion, and maybe some of you watching this evening would say that's where you are, the argument goes this way: science is based on evidence. Religion is based on wishful thinking. And you can pick up this idea and hear this idea all over the place. For example, Stephen Hawking, widely recognized as one of the greatest physicists of all time. He once wrote in one of the last books he wrote before his death, he talked about how science has triumphed over everything. It's triumphed over religion, it's triumphed over faith, it's even triumphed over philosophy. And when he uses the word philosophy in this quote, he's referring to religion as well, if you read the preceding paragraph. He says, philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. And here's the key idea. He said, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. In other words, we don't need philosophy, we don't need religion, science can do it all. Now, I can understand why science has been sort of elevated to quasi-religious status in our culture. I mean, science has gadgets and science has graphs and impressive machines, and it produces statistics and results and technology. And of course, our political leaders right now are in awe of science. We've seen this in the response to COVID, haven't we? With endless talk of following the science. Or, Nicola Sturgeon here recently, when the Pfizer vaccine was announced, she gave this beautiful little soundbite. She said, science has saved us, almost using a religious language. And this kind of elevation of science above everything else in our culture, I think has kind of fueled the belief that you sometimes hear that we don't need a God anymore, we don't need religion anymore, science has done away with God. Now, I love science. My academic background is a scientific one. My PhD was partly in computer science, developing computational linguistic models and tools for studying ancient texts. Try saying that without taking a breath. And I think science is one of the best things that human beings have ever invented. It's phenomenal. Yet for all of its power and for all of its effectiveness and its brilliance and even its beauty, there are, of course, many things that science can't do. And it's important, I think, to remember this. Remember that science has limits. And in some areas, science can do absolutely nothing at all. To just show you this with a very simple illustration, consider the Mona Lisa, one of the world's most famous paintings. And imagine we want to know why Leonardo da Vinci has painted Lisa del Giocondo with that enigmatic smile. I mean, is she puzzled? Is she contemplating? Is she constipated? I mean, what's going on there? Well, we could do all manner of scientific experiments on that picture. We could do chemical analyses of the paint. We could do dendrochronological studies of the wood frame, and we could just basically run a battery of scientific tests on that painting. But not a single one would tell us why Leonardo da Vinci painted that portrait that way. For that, we need a non-scientific discipline. We would need art history. And the fact that science has these limits, things it can't do, was actually pointed out by a Nobel Prize winning scientist, Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. And he wrote a very famous book called The Limits of Science. And he said that there is a limit to science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer. And indeed, no conceivable answer of science would empower it to answer. I have in mind questions like, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living? And I would add other questions to that list. I would say science can't tell us, for example, why the universe is rational. Why does science work in the first place? That puzzle kept Einstein awake at night, the famous physicist, trying to figure out why it was that science even worked. Or another question that has long puzzled scientists, why do mathematics and science fit together so well? After all, if there is no God, then numbers are just things that Mesopotamian goat herders invented sometime round about the 2nd millennium BC to keep track of their goats. But if that's the case, why is it that numbers and mathematics and physics fit so beautifully? Why do numbers describe the curvature of space-time, the growth patterns of flowers, or the orbits of planets or electrons? It's a big question in the philosophy of science. And then furthermore, you might ask, why is it that the human mind is so able to unlock the mysteries of the universe? Our minds seem to be able to figure out not simply how to survive and reproduce, but we can also unlock the secrets of black holes and quantum particles. And to those questions and to those mysteries, we might add other very deeply human questions. Think about human rights, for example. What is the value of a human life? Do human beings have inherent dignity? Do things like justice really matter? And of course, human rights theory is based on the assumption that, rights matter, humans have dignity, justice is important, but science can't tell us why those things are true. Science can't answer the question, what is the value of a life? Science may be able to tell us how to save a life. It can tell us how to extend a life. It can tell us how to abort a life or destroy a life, but it can't tell us the value of one. And that's simply because science, of course, when you think about it for a moment, is morally neutral. And the fact that science is morally neutral, I think, is tragically illustrated by the story of one of the greatest chemists of the 20th century, Louis Frederick Pfizer. He was instrumental in leading a team that developed the first artificial synthesis of vitamin K. And that's the vitamin that's responsible for blood coagulation. And his discovery of how you could synthesize that using a process in the laboratory led to medical breakthroughs that saved hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of lives. But Pfizer invented something else. In 1942, the US Army approached him and asked if he and his team at Harvard University would help them develop a weapon, a chemical weapon that could be used to clear tracts of jungle and eliminate troops. And Pfizer and his colleagues invented napalm, a gel that sticks to human flesh when it burns. On the 9th of March, 1945, 1,700 tons of the stuff were dropped on Tokyo, burning 100,000 civilians to death. And then many, many more civilians were killed by napalm during the Vietnam conflict. Now, maybe you can justify Pfizer's discovery in the broader context of World War II, although when you see, say, how napalm was used in Vietnam, it gets a lot harder. And Pfizer's story and his attempt to kind of brush the question under the carpet, I think, is a salutary reminder that science can harm as well as hurt. It's also a salutary reminder that science doesn't shut down religious or moral questions. Rather, science creates questions. And the more powerful we become through tools like science, I think the more danger we find ourselves in and the bigger the questions become. Because I think human beings are, if we are honest with ourselves, a bit of a moral mess. And science is often part of the problem, not the solution. Which reminds me of one final problem with science that loops us back around to why faith in God, I think, is so important and is not eliminated by science by a long way. And it's the issue that science actually can address symptoms, but it can't address the root causes of issues. Let me show what I mean. If we take one of the greatest challenges facing our world right now, the environmental challenges our planet is facing, from plastic in the ocean to pollution to climate change, the list goes on. What's the solution to our current environmental crisis? And it's easy to say, well, the answer is to reduce carbon emissions or ban plastic packaging or send Greta Thunberg on another world tour. But what if something much more profound is needed? Gus Speth is a leading climate scientist. For a long time, he was one of the US main advisors to the US government on environmental issues, now works at the United Nations. Brilliant scientist, probably one of the top 5 or 6 scientists in the world working on environmental and climate change issues. He knows more about the environment than probably most people alive today. And therefore, his diagnosis of the solution to the problems our world faces is interesting. As far as I know, Gus has no religious faith. Nothing I can find would indicate that he was a believer in God. But his diagnosis is fascinating. He wrote in an interview a few years ago, he said these words. He said, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And I thought that 30 years of good science could address those problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and a spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Now, interestingly, Christians who have been involved in the sciences since the very, very beginning of the scientific revolution, Christians have long realized that we need something more than just science and technology. Sure, science can bring you power and it can bring you all kinds of things, but there are some things it can't do. And in fact, as Jesus reminded us, he said, what good is it for a person to gain the whole world, to gain power over everything, perhaps using science and technology, but to forfeit his soul? Or what can a person give in exchange for their soul. In other words, Jesus is saying, we can gain power over nature. We can manipulate atoms. We can rip mountains apart. We can destroy ecosystems. We can find even faster ways to send digital memes around the world. But if in the process you lose your very self, what have you actually gained? And I wonder, you see, if the solution to the greatest challenges facing us needs more than just science. For the Bible tells us that the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. We have the ability to use science for great good. We have the ability to use science for great evil. And you see, God created us to be like him and to be in a relationship with him. But too often we want to be like God, we want to be God, and we like to grab power for ourselves and have damaged our world in the process. And I think the whole of human history tells the story of the human tendency to cause great damage with even good things like science. But thankfully, that story of the darkness in the human heart through history is not the end of the story. It's not the whole story. 18 months ago, the world celebrated the 50th anniversary of probably one of the greatest scientific projects ever undertaken, commemorating the moment when on the 24th of July, 1969, human beings first landed on the moon, the result of years of science and engineering, just a stunning scientific accomplishment. And it's interesting that when Neil Armstrong, the first human being to walk on the moon, it's interesting when you look at what he said when he first saw the Earth from space. It wasn't on the Apollo mission that went to the moon. The mission before that, when they were training for stuff, and they took a space capsule around the back of the moon, and he looked back from that space capsule, saw the planet Earth, and he was deeply humbled. And Neil Armstrong said these words. He said, "It suddenly struck me that tiny pea, pretty and blue, was the Earth. I put up my thumb and I shut one eye, and my thumb blotted out the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very, very small." Interesting, his reflection that technology had not elevated him, but made him very, very humble, actually, in terms of where he saw himself. But the wonderful news is that the Bible says that tiny blue pea, covered with even smaller people with the capacity to reach the stars, the capacity to split atoms apart, but also the capacity to destroy and hurt one another, those people, you and I, with all of our mess and brokenness, are actually very precious in God's eyes. And it tells us that God then stepped onto that tiny blue pea in the person of Jesus, so that we might have the chance not just of knowing science, but of knowing the designer behind the universe who made science possible, and knowing what life is really for. Because you see, my friends, we need answers, not just to the questions of how do we do stuff. And science is great at answering those kind of how questions. How do things work and how do we do stuff? But we also need to have answers to much more profound questions about why we're here and what human life is actually intended for. Questions that science was never designed to answer, questions that science can't possibly answer, but questions that Christianity, the worldview from which science sprang in the first place in the Middle Ages, might have something to say. In particular, from Jesus, who might have something to say, because Jesus said, "I have come that you might have life and have it to the full." Have it to the full, meaning not just the sciences and all of those things they can bring, but far more than that. And that's the invitation unique to Christianity, the invitation that God makes in Jesus Christ, not just to know that there is a creator who designed this beautiful universe, and science can help us understand how God did it and the way that he put things together, but the invitation also in Jesus Christ is that we can get to know that creator and that designer personally as he intended us for a relationship with him. Well, thanks for listening so patiently. And Mia, back to you to take us through the next part of the evening.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much. I've definitely had my eyes opened. Yeah, so some questions are coming in through our Slido link. Yeah, I'll just remind everyone that if you have any questions for Andy, anything that he said that might have made you wonder, yeah, no question is too big or too small. You can just send it through Slido. It should be in the comments. And there's also a Google form for you to fill out if any of this has made you wonder. Maybe Christianity does have something to say for you personally, then go ahead and fill out the Google form in the comments. Okay, well, our first question is, if we agree that science can't answer every question, is there, though, any scientific evidence to support Christianity?
Well, that's a brilliant question, Mia. So thank you for whoever asked that. And I'd say both. I want to make it really interesting and say both yes and no. Let me start with the no. I don't think using science you can answer every question about the Christian faith, because science isn't designed to really answer those kind of questions. Science works brilliantly within a world of stuff. Science tells us how stuff behaves. But once we start asking questions about things like the Christian faith, you're really asking why there is stuff in the first place. And of course, one of the biggest philosophical questions is why there is something rather than nothing. That's not a scientific question. That's bigger than the sciences. However, I still think there are clues using the sciences that would point us in the God direction, and then we then supplement that evidence from elsewhere. And I think there are three in particular, which I'll sketch very quickly, Mia. And then if people want to go dig into more information on that, if people look me up on sort of Facebook or wherever, I work for an organization called SOLAS, SOLAS, and we've got a video resource on our website called Short Answers, and we talk through a lot of the things I'm just going to flag up quickly in more detail. So if I've intrigued you, dig further. So three things very quickly. Firstly, there is the fact we have a universe at all in the first place. One of the oldest arguments for the existence of God is called the cosmological argument, and it simply goes like this: everything that begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause outside of itself. And very simply, things that come into existence have causes. We know this intuitively. That's why you don't look out in the garden in the morning wondering, I wonder whether a pink unicorn will have materialized overnight in my garden. Things don't come into existence without causes, whether they are unicorns or universes. Secondly, the universe began to exist, and that's not at all controversial. That's the kind of standard model in physics, that there is a beginning to space-time, the event we now know as the Big Bang. And then put those two premises together, and that leads inexorably to the conclusion there is something outside of the universe, something outside of space and time and matter. And you either have to then posit God, or you have something that looks so much like God, you might as well call it God in the first place. That's the first thing. Secondly, and I touched on this in the talk earlier, Mia, there's the fact that numbers and physics fit so well together. There was a Hungarian, I think, physicist called Eugene Wigner, in the 1950s, wrote a very famous paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Physical Sciences, just pondering this puzzle of why the heck do numbers and physics work so well together. It's just uncanny. It's either the world's most lucky coincidence or there's something going on. And I think most philosophers would say there's something going on. So the fact that numbers and physics work so well, that science and mathematics fits, is, I would say, a screaming great big clue that things look a bit suspicious. And then thirdly, there's the fine-tuning of the universe. Since the 1970s, lots of work that's been done in physics and cosmology has shown us just how carefully balanced many of the numbers are programmed into the laws of physics. Things like the gravitational constant that defines how strong the force of gravity is. If that was fractionally stronger, the universe would have collapsed back in on itself after the Big Bang. We wouldn't be here. And if it had been fractionally weaker, the universe would have expanded so rapidly there would not be time for stars and planets and galaxies to form, and we wouldn't be here. And physics is full of those kind of very strange coincidences. And what I would say, evidences like that, and there's others, Mia, I think point us towards the direction there is something that looks more and more like God behind the universe. My one caveat, that doesn't get you the God of the Bible. That just gets you a kind of generic God who's the creator. Then we need to begin asking, what is that God like? And that's when I would bring Jesus into the equation, because Jesus comes to us and says, rather than just have this kind of abstract God of the philosophers who's out there and unknowable, actually, this is a God who has a face and a God who steps into space and time and history and reveals himself to us. So there's arguments from science, I think, beautifully then complement the incredibly powerful argument we have from the life, ministry, and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, that's great. And you've touched on the Big Bang. You mentioned it twice there. And someone has sent in the question, would you say that evidence of the Big Bang disproves God's creation of the world? So science might say the Big Bang is how created, and then there's the creationist story from the Bible.
Oh, what a marvelous question. And the fun thing here, I would say categorically not. And I think what shows it's not the case is not many people are aware of where the term Big Bang comes from. The term Big Bang was coined by a physicist called Fred Hoyle around the middle of the 20th century. And Fred was a committed atheist, absolutely die-hard committed atheist, physicist, and cosmologist. And his theory, he believed the universe had always been in existence. He was an advocate of something called steady state theory that argued as the universe expands, more material just kind of comes into existence from nothing in the middle and the whole thing goes on forever. He liked that idea because he hated the idea of a beginning. And when Big Bang Theory was developed and then later proved, and the beautiful thing about Big Bang Theory, it was first posited by the likes of Einstein and others, and then it was demonstrated through discovering things like the cosmic microwave background radiation. It's a whole other story. And Hoyle got more and more upset because the more it became obvious there was a beginning to the universe, the more that raised an increasingly religious question. And so he coined the term Big Bang Theory. He said, this ridiculous Big Bang nonsense. He hated the idea because he saw where it pointed. So I would say Big Bang cosmology is incredibly powerful evidence for the existence of a creator, because as somebody once said, if you've got a Big Bang, you need a big banger. You need somebody to light the blue touch paper and sort of breathe life into the whole thing. And so I think it's very powerful evidence. There's another half of the question, of course, how that aligns with what the Bible has to say. But I love the fact that the very first words of God in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, are in the beginning. God said, "Let there be light." And I can't actually think of a better explanation, a better description in a way that an ancient Hebrew mind can understand for that massive explosion as a singularity roars outwards and matter comes into existence than "let there be light." And I just love that image of God just speaking it into existence, and whoomph, the whole of space-time just comes into existence at that point. And so many Christians in the physical sciences since the beginning of the 20th century would say they see absolutely no contradiction. And actually, it's interesting, cosmology is riddled with Christians. Actually, there's probably more Christians working in physics and cosmology than there are in things like biology and chemistry. And I think it's because of one of them I remember talking to a cosmologist at Cambridge University about this, and she said to me, it's because we find design everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's intricate mathematical design. You can't avoid it. You stumble across it everywhere. And she says, in my department is, stuffed full of religious believers, not all Christians, but religious believers everywhere.
Yeah, great. I love that explanation. Yeah, really good. Someone's put in this question. I feel like if I become a Christian, I have to give up my scientific logic and reasoning. What would your thoughts be on that?
Oh, what a great question, and hugely appreciate your honesty in kind of sort of raising that sort of personal tinge to that question. Well, first thing I would want to say straight away is you absolutely don't. You categorically don't, and that's demonstrated by the fact there are so many Christians and other religious believers as well, but especially Christians in the sciences. I mean, I mentioned earlier, like cosmology and physics is chock full of them. So got a friend of mine who's one of the sort of top physicists at Oxford University, Ard Louis, Dutch guy, absolutely brilliant, cutting edge physicist, committed Christian. Or in biology, you have someone like Francis Collins, who headed up the Human Genome Project, that great scientific project that first cracked the human genome. Committed Christian. In fact, I would encourage you to seek out his book. He wrote a wonderful book called The Language of God that really talks about his journey to discovering Christian faith, later in life, I think, into his postdoctoral years from memory. And the whole book is about how his faith and his belief in God go together. They go hand in hand, and he doesn't see them at all as contradictory. So I think the first thing I would say, the many, many, many women and men working in the physical science and the sciences show that not to be the case. But then the other thing I would say to you, as someone who loves the sciences and loves, I think you said, reason and so forth, I would encourage you to think about the question, where does reason and rationality best belong? Because here's the challenge for you. If you are an atheist and you want to be a pure, hard, cold atheist, and allow no room for God in any shape or form, okay, well, I just challenge people to follow that through, because that means that all that goes on between your ears is nothing more than the motion of particles. What's going on right now as you listen to me talk, you're not actually being reasonable or rational or conscious. That's just an illusion. All that's actually happening are particles are moving around, chemicals are sloshing, and that's generating some kind of strange sort of epiphenomenon that you think you're having an experience. And it's really interesting. You can find lots of atheists who are pretty hardcore on this, who say, yeah, there is no such thing as mind and reason and so forth. So Patricia Churchland, one of the leading neuroscientists and an atheist, she said, when it comes down to it, the only things that matter as far as organisms are concerned are the 4 Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproducing. Truth, whatever that is, doesn't even come into it. And I think that's tough, but she's being consistent. I would say to you, if reason matters, if mind matters, if you want to be a thinker, I would suggest to you that at that point, you need to ask, which worldview does that high belief on reason best located? And I think it is best located actually in the Christian faith, which says, yeah, there is such a thing as mind. We are more than the atoms of which we're made. Absolutely, of course, you're having a conscious experience, and of course your reason matters, because you are created in the image of a God who loves you, yes, but who also created you with the ability to think and reason, and also the same God who created the physical sciences. And the thing I loved when I was doing my PhD was the realization that all the work I was doing, using mathematics and analysis and computer science, fitted together so well in my Christian faith. It felt like both halves of my life came together, as I could just enjoy discovering the things that God had put into the world and using the tools that he created, but also realizing these things really mattered, that it wasn't just about survival and reproduction and atoms in motion. So yeah, absolutely. I would say, come on home to Jesus and the Christian faith.
Yes. And I love that you mentioned that book by Francis Collins. And I personally have a copy, and I'd love to lend it to you or anyone that's keen to read it. Don't have to spend any money. Just reach out.
There's the offer.
Right. So the next question is Christianity just a crutch, or would it actually help your life?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Is Christianity just a crutch, or would it help your life? Because in one sense, I suppose, it's interesting teasing that those things have been put in opposition, because I guess you could argue if Christianity was a crutch, it might help you anyway, because if your leg is broken, then perhaps a crutch is what you need. What I often hear, and I don't know if this was the way you intended the question, so I hope whoever asked this, I'm catching the pieces you were going for. Sometimes I hear people say Christianity is only a crutch. In other words, there's no truth value to it, but it's just useful because it helps you. There, I'd say the problem with that kind of argument is to go, that ignores a lot of the evidence for the Christian faith. We've talked about some this evening. It also ignores the fact that, of course, the same would apply to other things. I mean, presumably maybe atheism isn't true. It's just a psychological crutch. Some people are drawn to atheism. Some people are drawn to Christianity. At the end of the day, we just collapse and are reduced to our psychology. I happen to think we can get beyond psychology, and we can ask, okay, well, this helps us, or potentially helps us, but is it also true? Because I think that matters profoundly at the end of the day. If you go skydiving and you jump out of the aeroplane, probably you're going to be psychologically drawn to the idea of parachutes. The idea of a parachute is psychologically quite comforting when you jump out of an aeroplane and go skydiving. But you need to know when you pull the ripcord that it's just not wishful thinking. You need to know there is actually a parachute back there, not just a rucksack, and that actually it's not just psychologically comforting, but it's also true. And I think that's important. However, the kind of second half of your question, I think Christianity does make a difference, and it makes a difference in a huge number of ways. But by far the biggest one, let me just share this, and other members of the CU, I'm sure if you want to talk to in time, could answer other things in different ways. I think one of the things that I find so profoundly helpful about Christianity is that we live in a culture that encourages us to make something the center of our life. And all of us will make something the center. Every human being makes something the center of their life, because we're wired to be worshippers. And all of us worship something. And if it's not God, it's going to be things like career, or sexuality, or your image, or your academic performance. There'll be something that you make the center of your life, that you build everything on, and that gets you up in the morning. But the problem is, and I think COVID has exposed this spectacularly in the last year, is a lot of these things that we built our life on actually let us down ultimately when we need them. I think a lot of people have had their careers taken away in the last year. Maybe your idol, a thing that you worshipped, was having this wonderful life at university and hanging out with friends and the parties and the social life. And of course, that's all gone. You're all sitting in rooms staring at screens. For some of us, it's been our health, or perhaps it's been relationships. That's someone we love dearly we lost during the pandemic. And all of those other things get swept away. What I found profoundly comforting about Christian faith is Jesus is the rock on which you can build and isn't swept away. Becoming a Christian doesn't guarantee that life will not be difficult. I have had some difficult times in the years that I've become a Christian. Things have happened. Life has been difficult at times. But what has been so tremendously encouraging is underneath it all is that sense that my feet are on the rock of Jesus. And no matter what happens, what else is taken away from me, he is always there. So yes, Christianity is psychologically comforting. Yes, it's deeply encouraging, even a crutch if you wanted to use that word, but it's a crutch that's based on something. It's based on an actual reality. There is a parachute as you jump out of the aeroplane of life. And I can say that having tested that, in the battlefield of life for the last 30 years of following Jesus, he has never once let me down. Hasn't always been easy, but Jesus has never let me down. And I would commend him to anybody.
Yeah, I agree. And I've not been on the planet for nearly as many years as you, but I agree. Yeah.
Thanks, Mia. I feel really old. That was nicely done.
Well, I haven't said what your age is. I haven't said what my age is.
That's great. That's all right. I'm an old fogey. Don't worry. It's all right.
Right. Moving on to the next question. You say that you can't create something from nothing without God, but what if the universe had no beginning and has just always existed forever? This person says it's a new theory right now.
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. It's not a new theory, actually. The idea that the universe has always been here is actually one of the oldest theories. Certainly, that was the belief in the ancient world thousands of years ago. That was the fairly common belief that the universe had always kind of been here. And actually, certainly the Jewish people, when the Old Testament was first written down, were actually fairly rare, actually, for believing that the universe had come into existence. There was a much more common idea, was that the universe just went in cycles and had always been here. We come to the 20th century, and I mentioned Fred Hoyle earlier. Certainly the standard idea was the universe had always been here. And really what changed the idea that the universe had always been here was in the early part of the 20th century, when Albert Einstein developed his new theory of relativity, began running the numbers on the equations he'd come up with, and got a bit nervous that the equations showed there was a beginning to space-time. And he knew there couldn't be a beginning to space-time because everybody knew the universe had always been here. So he literally fudged his mathematics. He introduced something called the cosmological constant into his numbers to give him an eternal universe. And he actually later described that as the greatest blunder of my entire scientific career, because he could have come up with the Big Bang theory, decades before others kind of refined it. And then as we moved on into the 20th century, the idea there was a beginning to space-time was actually proven by a number of observations in physics, things like redshift in galaxies that Edwin Hubble observed, and then what's called the cosmic microwave background radiation, that wherever you point radio telescopes in the night sky, you get the same kind of static in the background, that is quite literally the heat signature of the Big Bang. So I would say the standard model in physics is that the universe did have a beginning. You occasionally get theoretical sorts of people who are experimenting and will come up with alternative ideas. For example, Lawrence Krauss, the American atheist and cosmologist, wrote a book a few years ago called Universe from Nothing, in which he tried to argue the universe just winked into existence. That's been largely rubbished in the scientific community because he cleverly redefines nothing. He redefines nothing to mean sort of a field of quantum particles fluctuating in various ways. And as his critics said, well, Lawrence, that's not nothing. That's a cosmic field. That's a field of quantum particles. That isn't really nothing. And then Stephen Hawking came in on the act. He wrote a book in which he said, well, all we need is the law of gravity, and the universe will create itself. And again, critics went, Stephen, the law of gravity is not nothing. And so I would actually say, no, the theory right now is not the universe came from nothing, but actually it does have some kind of absolute beginning to space and time. All of our mathematics and all of our observations point in that way. But one other thought kind of for you, of course, the other problem with saying the universe has always been here is, to get very philosophical for you, I'll try and go through this as simply as I can. If the universe has always been here, we couldn't be at this point, because you can't cross an infinite amount of time. If I say to Mia, this is great, chatting to you, I'd love to see you and the CU guys for coffee when we can, I'll meet you in an infinite amount of time. I'm never going to meet them for coffee, because you can't cross an infinite distance. And philosophers and physicists will say, if there's an infinite amount of time before us, if the universe has always been here, we couldn't be at this spot. And it's quite a complex kind of mathematical idea, but quite simply, mathematicians would say, no, the universe hasn't always been here. It doesn't work. So I think you end up with some kind of creator or something outside of the universe creating it. But as I say all along, I want to stress that the idea that there is a creator to the universe, and I think physics gets us there very strongly, that still doesn't tell us what kind of creator we're talking about, which is why I always want to couple together these arguments from science with, okay, let's look at what Jesus claimed for himself. Because when you realize that the life of Jesus, and particularly the resurrection, stands up so powerfully, that then gives in detail to what kind of God we're talking about. And one of the things I love about the Christian faith is you can take arguments from science and philosophy, mathematics, and you can do arguments from morality and other kind of pieces, and then you can weave those together with arguments from history and Jesus, and you end up with this multi-stranded kind of rope that supports the Christian faith. And if you ask me why I'm a Christian today and to give reasons, I've probably got 50 or 60 lines of evidence that I could take that come together, that complement each other, culminating in Jesus and who he is, but supported by so many other things. And it's really exciting. And it also means it's so much fun to be a Christian, because you can pursue mathematics, you can pursue philosophy, you can pursue science, all of these things, not afraid that you'll suddenly lift some rock and go, oh, Struth, the Christian faith doesn't stand up. It's absolutely exciting. It's so stimulating to be a Christian on so many levels.
It really is, yeah. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we have one more question. I think this is sort of related to the one before about Big Bang versus God's version of creation or the Bible. What would you say in response to the evidence that we have today for evolution? And does that correspond with God, the story of how God made Adam and Eve in the garden?
Yeah, a great question. I was wondering whether we were going to. I realized we were doing a lot of cosmology, and whether there be any biologists on the call going, hang on a minute, let's talk about a different discipline. So yeah, let's talk about evolution very, very briefly, because there's so much that could be said here. And you mentioned, and I mentioned, The Language of God by Francis Collins. Strongly recommend that book, and Mia's volunteering to lend her copy out, because he talks about some of this. What I'd say very simply is, firstly, in terms of the book of Genesis, remember what Genesis was written to do. Genesis wasn't written to 21st century people who know all of our sciences. It was written to be able to be read, yes, by folks in the 21st century, but it was also written to be read by people, 2,000 years ago, and also to understand what it's saying. And I think Genesis is far more concerned with much bigger questions like, is there a creator? What is God like? What's his relationship with us? What's gone wrong? It's not concerned so much with the mechanisms of how God did it. That's why the first verse of Genesis is not E equals MC squared, but it's in the beginning God. So I think read it that way. Ask the questions of the book of Genesis that it's trying to answer. Don't try and make it answer the questions it's not trying to answer, because you'll end up tying yourself in knots. But in terms of evolutionary theory, Christians hold a variety of positions on there. But I would say, of course, if God chose to create through the process of evolution in some shape or form, and there's a whole range of theories that would come under the rubric of evolution. Sometimes we think there is just one, there are multiple ones. What I find fascinating is that, again, we end up with a designer, because underpinning everything in the whole of biology, and in fact is required for evolution and so forth, and then survival and reproduction to work, is of course the genetic code. And I remember being very, very stunned as my early years as a Christian, beginning to try and sort of put some flesh to the bones and do some thinking behind my Christian faith. My background's computer science, that was my academic background. And, it stunned me when I discovered that when you look inside the DNA of every living thing, it's a biological programming language. In fact, I think it was Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist biologist from Oxford, says if you want to think about life, think about digital technology. Now, when I read that blew me away, because I was like, well, okay, I know computer programming. Computer languages do not just spontaneously arise. The C programming language that underpins, all of our modern operating systems, that was designed. That took a lot of effort by a lot of men and women who built that thing so that you could build things on top. And underlying life is this incredible biological programming language. And it has many of the functions that we see in human programming languages, and the way that it shuffles things around, the way it handles, variables, procedures, conditional branching, this goes on and on and on. I won't bore you with all this computer science geekery. And it's just incredible. So again, just as like in cosmology, we look down to the lowest level in cosmology and we see numbers and beautiful, equations balanced intricately. And we see, gosh, there's design and beauty there in physics. And we look inside the cell in biology and we see design and information and order and structure in this incredibly intricate biological programming language. And to me, that doesn't say, oh, this thing just happened. It says, there's a designer. You see design wherever you look. And so I think Christians, or those who are thinking about faith, you don't need to be afraid of evolution. You don't need to be afraid of cosmology. I think they all fit together beautifully because the same designer stands behind all of them. But as I said in my talk, a designer who then steps into history, steps into the world that he has created, and offers us the ability to know him and be brought into a relationship with him, not just know sort of theoretically in some abstract way that he's real.
I think you tied that together beautifully. And I will just say that if we haven't had the chance to answer your question, or you need a few more days, or you can take 2 weeks to come up with some questions, because we're having a Guerrilla Christian panel on the 10th of February where Andy will be joining us along some other Christians, some that might have a little bit less scientific knowledge, but they're still Christians, and you can grill them with all of your questions. Yes, and so please have a look at our social media for other events and get in touch with us. And as I said, there's a Google form for you to fill out if you would like to reach out to the CU, or reach out to borrow that book that I said, that Andy mentioned. But yeah, that's us for this evening. We'd love to see you in 2 weeks' time for our events week to see if there is something more. And thank you to you, Andy. I hope you have a lovely evening and a good weekend.
Thanks very much. Same to you, and goodbye.